She whispered the Sicilian oath, and the room froze. The Mafia boss didn't shout, didn't move, just stared like I'd signed my own death warrant. By nightfall, my door would be open and someone would be erasing me. The November rain turned the streets of Barcelona into black mirrors, reflecting the kind of cold that seeped through skin and settled in bones. I kept my head down as I hurried through the unmarked entrance of Luminosa, the invitation-only restaurant where I'd worked for exactly 4 months and 11 days. My uniform was damp, my hair plastered against my neck, and my hands, despite the gloves I'd pawned my grandmother's rosary to buy, were numb. I was 12 minutes late.
I sabla.
Final meant. Ricardo's voice cut through the kitchen's controlled chaos before I'd even tied my apron. The floor manager's usually composed face was tight with something I'd never seen before. Fear. You're serving the private room tonight. Tables already seated. My fingers fumbled with the apron strings. That's Camila's section. Ricardo's hand shot out, gripping my wrist hard enough to leave marks. Camila is not coming. Listen to me very carefully, Nina. These men. He glanced toward the kitchen doors, then back to me, lowering his voice to barely a whisper. They are important. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact unless necessary. Do not, por Dios, do not screw this up. The tremor in his voice made my stomach clench. I needed this job. 6 months ago, I'd fled Madrid with nothing but a backpack and 300 euros folded inside my shoe. My studio apartment above the bodega cost more than I made in tips most weeks, and the electric bill was 2 weeks overdue. Barcelona was supposed to be my fresh start, a city big enough to disappear in. Disappearing was the only thing I'd gotten good at. Who are they? I asked, straightening my collar, tucking away the strand of hair that never stayed pinned. Ricardo's eyes darted to the sous chef, then back. Business associates of Navarro. My blood turned to ice water. Everyone who worked at Luminosa knew that name. Mateo Navarro. The owner who never appeared in photographs, whose signature appeared on our paychecks, but whose face remained a mystery. Some of the older servers whispered he was a venture capitalist. Others claimed he owned half the shipping routes between here and Palermo. The younger ones, the ones who watched too many crime dramas, said he was connected. I'd learned not to ask questions I didn't want answered. They're in the Sala Privata, Ricardo continued, already pushing me toward the doors. Professional. Efficient. Invisible. And teens. I understood. Invisible had become my specialty. Keep your head down. Blend into the wallpaper. Become background noise to the world around you. I smoothed my black skirt, grabbed my leather order pad, and pushed through the double doors. The main dining room of Luminosa glowed like old money, crystal chandeliers casting amber light across white tablecloths, the soft murmur of Spanish and Italian blending with the clink of silver on porcelain. This was the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, vast and unassailable. I moved through the space with practiced efficiency, spine straight, chin level, past the couples sharing bottles of wine that cost more than my monthly rent. At the back of the restaurant, tucked behind a curtain of burgundy velvet, a short hallway led to the Sala Privata, the private room. I stopped at the heavy oak door, my pulse hammering in my throat. My hand was halfway to knocking when I heard it. Men's voices, low and controlled, speaking in a dialect of Sicilian I hadn't heard since childhood. I knocked once.
Soft.
Professional. Then I entered. The Sala Privata was dimmer than the main dining room, lit by sconces that cast long shadows across mahogany paneling. A round table dominated the center, large enough for 8, currently seating 6. All men. All in suits that could have paid my rent for a year. Their conversation stopped the moment I stepped inside. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward me, but only one gaze held. He sat at what should have been an arbitrary position at a round table, yet somehow commanded it as though the entire room bent toward him. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a line that suggested smiling was a long-forgotten skill. His suit was charcoal, perfectly tailored across broad shoulders, the kind of craftsmanship that whispered rather than shouted wealth. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath.
Dark.
Intelligent. Cold as midwinter stone. He looked younger than I'd expected, mid-30s, maybe, which somehow made him more dangerous. Men this powerful weren't usually this young. I dropped my gaze immediately, heat creeping up my neck. "Good evening, gentlemen." My voice came out steady, professional. "A small victory. I'm Isabella, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. May I start with drinks?" I moved around the table efficiently, pen poised over my pad, acutely aware of the weight of his stare tracking my every movement. The other men ordered quickly, whiskey, bourbon, and a Negroni. When I reached him last, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied me the way a jeweler studies a stone under light, searching for flaws. "You're new," he said finally. Not a question. A statement delivered in Spanish, so precise it could have been a scalpel. "For months, sir." I kept my pen ready, my eyes on my notepad. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, touched the corner of his mouth. "Barolo, 98 if you have it. If not, surprise me." I nodded and turned toward the door, but it opened before I could reach it. A man in a black suit entered, his movements deferential as he approached the table. He bent low, whispering something into the seated man's ear. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I slipped out, closing the door behind me, and allowed myself one shaky breath. The hallway suddenly felt like a sanctuary. Whatever was happening in that room, whatever those men were discussing in the shadows, I wanted no part of it. I hurried to the bar to place the orders, my hands trembling slightly as I wrote them down. When I returned 10 minutes later with a tray of drinks, the atmosphere had shifted. The men's voices were lower now, edged with tension. Papers were spread across the table between them, and the air felt thinner, harder to breathe. I distributed the drinks silently, moving like a ghost. Professional. Efficient. Invisible. As I placed the Barolo in front of him, Matteo Navarro, my mind supplied, though no one had confirmed it, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I never took personal calls during shifts. Ever. But the hospice nurse had my number on speed dial, and every vibration felt like a countdown.
Rana.
I glanced at the screen as I stepped back toward the wall. The nurse's name flashed across it. My chest tightened, my free hand curling into a fist against my thigh. I took 2 quiet steps toward the door and answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Pronto." The nurse's voice came through gentle, regretful. My grandmother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to tie my shoes and say my prayers and keep dangerous secrets, was gone. I closed my eyes, biting down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep the tears at bay. When I opened them again, the entire room had gone silent. All 6 men were watching me. But Matteo Navarro's gaze was different now. Sharper. More focused. His head tilted slightly, like a predator catching an unexpected scent. I realized, with the slow sinking horror of someone who'd just stepped off a cliff, that I'd spoken Italian. Fluent. Native. The kind of Italian that only comes from blood and bone and years of whispered bedtime stories. "I apologize for the interruption," I stammered, slipping the phone back into my pocket. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Are you ready to order?" The dinner stretched on for hours. I moved in and out of the sala privata like a shadow, bringing courses, refilling glasses, clearing plates. Each time I entered, I felt his eyes on me, tracking, analyzing, cataloging. Once, when I leaned between 2 of the men to place a dish, I caught the scent of his cologne, cedar and smoke and something darker, something that smelled like control. The men spoke in low tones, switching seamlessly between Spanish, Italian, and Sicilian. I understood every word, discussions of shipments and territories, percentages and penalties, names spoken like incantations, but I kept my face carefully blank, the way my grandmother had taught me. Never let them know you're listening, Isabella. Never let them see you understand. Invisible. Professional. Just part of the furniture. It was past midnight when they finally prepared to leave. I presented the check in a leather folder. Matteo Navarro didn't look at it. He simply placed a black card on top and slid it back toward me. When I returned with the receipt, he signed it with a flourish I couldn't decipher, then held the folder out. As I reached for it, his fingers lingered, just a heartbeat too long on mine. Grazie, Isabella, he said, my name rolling off his tongue in perfect Italian, shaped by a Sicilian accent I recognized from my childhood. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and stepped back as the men gathered their coats and papers. They filed toward the door, Matteo Navarro last. At the threshold, he paused, turned. His dark eyes found mine across the room, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 lifetimes, we stood in silence. Then he spoke, not to me, but to the man in the black suit hovering at his shoulder. His voice was quiet, controlled, lethal. Find out who taught her those words. My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken any words. I'd barely spoken at all. But then I remembered the phone call, the stress, the reflexive whisper I'd breathed under my breath when my hands had started shaking while pouring wine. A vita è cosa nostra. Life is ours. The oath my grandmother used to murmur like a prayer late at night when she thought I was sleeping. The phrase I'd never understood. The words that were never meant to be spoken outside our small apartment with its locked doors and drawn curtains. Matteo Navarro's gaze hadn't left mine. And don't let her leave alone. If you're enjoying this story, click the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. I stood frozen in the empty sala privata, surrounded by empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins, my pulse roaring in my ears. I should have been terrified. I should have run. But all I could think about was my grandmother, sitting in her chair by the window of our old apartment, her voice barely a whisper as she told me stories I was too young to understand. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. I stood frozen in the empty sala privata, surrounded by empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins, my pulse roaring in my ears. The scent of expensive cologne and cigar smoke lingered in the air like a warning. Find out who taught her those words. Don't let her leave alone. My hands were shaking as I began clearing the table. I stacked plates with mechanical precision, my mind racing through every moment of the evening, trying to understand what I'd done wrong. When had I said it? The phrase my grandmother whispered like prayers in the dark? A vita è cosa nostra. I must have muttered it during the phone call, or when my hands had trembled while pouring wine. Some reflexive whisper when stress turned my thoughts back to childhood, back to the small apartment in Palermo where Nana spoke in riddles and warnings. The tray trembled in my hands as I pushed through the door back into the main dining room. Ricardo stood near the bar, his face gray, his eyes tracking my movements like I was a bomb that might detonate. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly and disappeared into his office without a word. That's when I knew. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't just important. It was dangerous. The main dining room had emptied. Only 2 tables remained, couples lingering over dessert and digestives. The other servers moved through their closing duties with practiced efficiency, but I felt their glances, their carefully averted eyes. News traveled fast in a place like Luminosa. The new girl had served Navarro's table. The new girl had done something. The new girl was marked. I kept my head down, cleared my section, refilled water glasses that didn't need refilling. Anything to look busy, to blend back into the wallpaper. But I felt eyes on me. Not Ricardo's. Not the other servers. I glanced toward the bar, and my breath caught. 2 men in dark suits sat at the far end, both nursing whiskeys they hadn't touched. I recognized one of them, the man who'd whispered in Matteo Navarro's ear during dinner. They weren't looking at me directly, but I could feel their attention the way prey feels the gaze of predators downwind. My stomach twisted. I carried my tray back to the kitchen, moving through the swinging doors into the bright fluorescent chaos of the dish station. Steam rose from industrial sinks. The night crew shouted over the clatter of pots and pans. Isabella. Marco, the head chef, caught my elbow as I set down my tray. His voice was low, urgent. You need to go home.
Now.
My shift doesn't end for another.
Now.
His fingers tightened on my arm. Clock out. Use the back exit. Don't ask questions. The kindness in his eyes looked like pity. I nodded, untying my apron with numb fingers. In the staff room, I grabbed my coat and bag, my hands moving through the motions while my mind spun in circles. The back exit led to an alley behind the restaurant, the kind of narrow passage where trash bins overflowed and cooking grease stained the cobblestones. I hesitated at the door, my hand on the push bar. Don't let her leave alone. But staying felt more dangerous than leaving. I pushed through into the November night. The cold hit me like a slap. Rain had turned to mist, hanging in the air like suspended breath. The alley was dark except for a single flickering light above the kitchen door. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Los Romblos, the city's heartbeat pulsing just blocks away. I turned left, toward the main street, my footsteps echoing off wet stone. That's when I heard them. 2 sets of footsteps. Heavier than mine. Measured. Patient. I didn't look back. Every instinct my grandmother had drilled into me screamed to keep moving, to not acknowledge, to not engage. I walked faster, my hand diving into my bag to find my phone. The footsteps matched my pace. My fingers closed around my phone just as a voice cut through the darkness. Isabella Reyes. I froze. Not a question. A statement. My full name, spoken with the casual authority of someone who'd already looked into my life, cataloged my details, knew where I lived. I turned slowly. The 2 men from the bar stood 10 feet behind me, backlit by the kitchen's stuttering light. The taller one, the one who'd whispered to Navarro, had his hands in his coat pockets. His face was unremarkable, the kind you'd forget in a crowd, which somehow made him more frightening. Mr. Navarro would like a word, he said in Spanish. Polite. Professional. Absolutely terrifying. My throat went dry. I'm off the clock. It won't take long. He gestured toward a black sedan parked at the alley's mouth, its engine running, its windows tinted to opacity. Please.
Please.
As if I had a choice. Every survival instinct I possessed told me not to get in that car. But every other instinct, the ones shaped by years of watching my grandmother flinch at shadows, of learning that powerful men didn't ask twice, told me refusal would be worse. I walked toward the sedan, my legs mechanical, my mind detached from my body, like I was watching someone else make this decision. The second man opened the rear door. Inside, Mateo Navarro sat with the stillness of a statue, one arm draped across the back seat, his dark eyes reflecting the alley's dim light. He'd removed his suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to his forearms. Somehow, this version of him, slightly undone, casual, was more intimidating than the controlled precision I'd seen at dinner. Sit. Not a request. I climbed in. The door closed behind me with the solid thunk of German engineering. The interior smelled like leather and that cedar cologne. The driver, a third man I hadn't seen, sat motionless behind the wheel. Mateo Navarro didn't look at me immediately. He gazed out the window at the rain-slick alley, his expression unreadable. For months, he said finally, his voice quiet. You've worked at Luminosa for 4 months. Yes. Before that, my mouth went dry. I moved here from Madrid. Before Madrid? I hesitated. That hesitation was an answer in itself. He turned to face me then, and the full weight of his attention was like standing too close to a fire. Your application listed no family. No references beyond a landlord in Madrid who doesn't remember you. No social media presence. No digital footprint before 6 months ago. He tilted his head. You're very careful, Isabella. Or very well trained. I'm not trained in anything, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. I just keep to myself. Interesting. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone, my phone. The one that should have been in my bag. This call you received tonight. The one that made you speak Italian. I spread through my chest. That was private. Nothing is private in my restaurants. He tapped the screen, and I heard my own voice, tinged with grief. Pronto. Then the nurse's gentle regret explaining my grandmother's passing. When the recording ended, Mateo's eyes found mine. My condolences. The sympathy in his voice felt like a knife wound. What do you want? I whispered. A vita e cosa nostra. He pronounced each word with the weight of a funeral rite. Do you know what you said? It's just something my grandmother used to say. Your Sicilian grandmother. Not a question. She was from Palermo, I admitted. What was the point in lying now? She came here when I was small.
She's dead now.
That's all there is. That's all. His smile was sharp as broken glass. Those words aren't a casual phrase, Isabella. They're an oath. A very old one. The kind spoken by families bound to codes that predate governments. Codes written in blood and silence. He leaned forward slightly, and I pressed back against the seat. So I'll ask you again, with perfect clarity, who taught you those words and why? Palermo, 1998. I was 7 years old, small enough to hide behind my grandmother's skirts when men with hard faces came to our apartment. Nana would sit me in the corner with my coloring books and speak to them in the old dialect, the one she told me never to use in public. After they left, she'd kneel in front of me, her gnarled hands cupping my face. Never speak the old words, Isabella. Never let them know you understand. The world outside this room is full of men who listen for the wrong things. And once they hear you, they never unhear you. But what do the words mean, Nana? They mean loyalty until death. They mean silence is sacred. They mean family is everything. Her eyes had been sad, so terribly sad. And they mean your grandfather died for refusing to break them. My grandmother was superstitious, I said, pulling myself back to the present, to this car, to this man whose eyes could see through lies. She believed in old stories, old ways. She taught me phrases the way other grandmothers teach prayers. And your grandfather? Dead before I was born.
How?
Does it matter? Matteo's jaw tightened. Everything matters, Isabella. Details matter. Timing matters. The fact that you appeared in my restaurant in my city, speaking words that shouldn't exist outside a very specific bloodline, that matters most of all. I didn't appear, I said, finding anger beneath my fear. I applied for a job. I needed work. That's all this is.
No.
He said it with absolute certainty. That's not all this is. He nodded to the driver, who pulled the car forward, out of the alley, and into the flow of Barcelona's midnight traffic. My heart hammered against my ribs. Where are we going? I'm taking you home, Matteo said calmly. But first, you're going to tell me everything about your grandmother. Where she came from, who she knew, why she fled Sicily. His eyes held mine. And then I'm going to decide whether you're a threat or an asset. I'm neither, I said desperately. I'm just a waitress. No, Isabella. His voice dropped to something dangerously soft. You stopped being just a waitress the moment those words left your lips. The car turned down a narrow street I didn't recognize. The rain picked up, drumming against the roof like fingernails. I don't know anything, I whispered. My grandmother never told me the full stories. She just taught me to be quiet, to disappear. Then you learned well. He studied me for a long moment, but disappearing only works until someone is looking for you. And now, Isabella Reyes, I am looking. The car stopped in front of my building, my anonymous, crumbling apartment building in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. The fact that he knew exactly where I lived, without asking for an address, sent terror sliding down my spine. The driver opened my door. Cold air rushed in. Go inside, Matteo said. Lock your door. Sleep if you can. His next words were a promise and a threat braided together. Tomorrow, we continue this conversation. I climbed out on shaking legs, clutching my bag to my chest. Just before the door closed, Matteo leaned forward into the light. Isabella, don't run. There's nowhere I won't find you. The door shut. The sedan pulled away, its taillights bleeding red into the mist. I stood on the wet sidewalk, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. Then I looked up at my apartment's dark windows and noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. My light was on. I never left lights on. Ever. Someone had been inside. And as I climbed the stairs to my third-floor walk-up, I felt it with absolute certainty. I was no longer alone. I would never be alone again. The subway platform was nearly empty at this hour. Just me, an elderly woman asleep on a bench, and a man in a Yankees cap scrolling through his phone 20 feet away. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow. Somewhere in the tunnel, water dripped with metronomic persistence. I stood near the edge of the platform, my bag clutched against my ribs, watching the darkness of the tunnel for the approaching train. The man in the Yankees cap hadn't looked up from his phone once. That's how I knew he was one of them.
Normal people looked around,
Shifted their weight,
checked the time.
showed some sign of impatience or boredom or life. This man was perfectly still except for the occasional swipe of his thumb across the screen, a performance of normalcy that was almost convincing. Almost. My hands were shaking. I shoved them into my pockets and felt my phone there, the screen still lit from the last message. Asterisk, we're not going to hurt you, I sabla. We're going to keep you safe. Asterisk. Whether you want us to or not. The train's headlights appeared in the tunnel, growing brighter. The rumble of wheels on tracks filled the platform. Wind pushed ahead of it, carrying the smell of electricity and metal and 1,000 commutes. The doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. I stepped inside an empty car and sat near the middle, back to the wall, so I could watch both doors. The man in the Yankees cap got on 3 cars down. Through the scratched windows, I could see him take a seat, still absorbed in his phone. The train lurched into motion. I had 23 stops until my station. 23 stops to figure out what to do.
Call the police.
And tell them what? That I was being followed by well-dressed men who hadn't actually touched me or threatened me directly. That my only evidence was a feeling and 2 text messages that could have been from anyone? Call someone. Anyone. But there was no one. No family except a grandmother who died 6 months ago. No close friends. I'd made sure of that when I fled Boston. No boyfriend, no roommate, no one who would notice if I didn't come home tonight. That had been the point. Isolation was safety. Anonymity was survival. Now it was a trap I'd built for myself. The train rattled through the tunnel, stopping and starting, swallowing and spitting out the handful of late-night passengers. I watched the man in the Yankees cap through the windows. He never looked at me directly, but I could feel his awareness like a weight. At the 14th stop, a woman got on my car. Mid-30s, business suit, heels in her hand and sneakers on her feet. She sat across from me and pulled out a book. For a moment, I considered speaking to her, asking to borrow her phone, telling her I thought I was being followed. But what would happen to her if I dragged her into this? I stayed silent. My stop came too quickly. I stepped onto the platform in Queens, into a neighborhood that had felt safe and anonymous 6 months ago, but now felt exposed under the harsh streetlights. The woman in the business suit headed toward the stairs. I waited, watching. The man in the Yankees cap didn't get off. But 2 stops later, I could see it on the subway map in my mind. There was a station where the trains ran express back into Manhattan. He could loop around. They probably had people at both ends, a net tightening. I climbed the stairs to street level. My apartment building was 4 blocks away. Red brick, 6 floors, 100 identical windows. I'd chosen it because it was cheap and asked no questions. The landlord had taken 3 months' rent in cash and never asked to see my references. Now, walking through streets that were too quiet and too dark, I wondered if anonymity had been a mistake. I passed the corner store where I bought milk and bread. The laundromat where I washed my uniforms every Sunday. The bus stop where I'd waited countless mornings, half asleep and cold. My normal life. My small, careful, invisible life. It felt like it belonged to someone else now. At the intersection before my building, I stopped. A black car was parked across the street. Engine off, windows tinted, no plates visible from this angle. It hadn't been there this morning. I would have noticed. Keep walking. Don't react. You're imagining things. But I wasn't. As I stood there, frozen on the corner, a second car turned onto the street behind me. Dark sedan. Moving slowly. Too slowly for someone just passing through. My heartbeat filled my ears. I could run, sprint the remaining block to my building, unlock the door, race up 6 flights of stairs to my apartment, lock myself inside, and push furniture against the door, and then what? If they wanted to reach me, a deadbolt wouldn't stop them. Nothing would stop them. The second car pulled up beside me. The rear window rolled down with an electric whir. A man I'd never seen before looked out at me. Older, maybe 50, with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen too much. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Miss Reyes," he said, his voice courteous and final. "Mr. Navarro would like to speak with you. Please get in the car."
Please. As if I had a choice.
And if I don't? My voice came out steadier than I felt. The man's expression didn't change. Mr. Navarro was very clear. "We're to ensure your safety tonight. That's easier to do if you cooperate, but the outcome is the same either way." Across the street, the doors of the black car opened. 2 men stepped out. Not running, not rushing, just standing there, patient and inevitable. The net had closed. I looked up at my apartment building. 6th floor, 3rd window from the left. I could see the faint glow of the lamp I'd left on this morning. My books were up there. My clothes. My coffee maker and the one photograph I'd brought from Boston, me and my grandmother in her kitchen, flower on her hands, smiling. My entire life fit in 400 square feet. And I was about to lose it. My phone, I heard myself say. And my bag. I want to leave them here. The man in the car tilted his head slightly. Why? Because if I disappear, someone needs to know I didn't go willingly. Because breadcrumbs matter, even if no one's looking for me. Because I need to believe I still have some control over what happens next. Because I want to, I said. He considered this, then nodded once. I set my bag down on the sidewalk, pulled out my phone, and placed it on top. The screen was dark now, the messages from unknown numbers gone. Then I got in the car. I didn't fight, didn't scream or struggle or try to run when the door closed and the locks engaged with a soft click. What would have been the point? The man who'd spoken to me sat across from me in the spacious back seat. The other 2 got into the black car. Both vehicles pulled away from the curb in synchronized motion. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere safe." I was safe at home. "No, Miss Reyes."
He pulled out a phone and typed something.
"You really weren't." We drove in silence after that. Out of Queens, across a bridge where the city lights reflected off black water. Through neighborhoods that got progressively quieter, wealthier, more removed from the world I knew. I tried to track the turns, to memorize landmarks, but after 20 minutes I was lost. The man across from me made a phone call in Italian. I caught fragments. Asterisk, she's cooperative, no issues, 20 minutes out asterisk. But he kept his voice low and his eyes on me. Finally, we turned onto a private road. Trees on both sides, branches forming a canopy overhead. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a high stone wall, an iron gate that opened as we approached. Then a house, no, an estate, rose out of the shadows like something from another century. 3 stories of pale stone and tall windows. Manicured grounds despite the late season. Lights glowing warm behind curtains. It looked like the kind of place that appeared in magazines, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had existed for generations. The car stopped at the front entrance. "This way, please," the man said, opening the door. I stepped out onto gravel that crunched under my cheap shoes. The air smelled different here, cleaner, greener, untouched by the city's exhaust and desperation. A woman appeared at the entrance. Older, elegant, dressed in dark slacks and a cream blouse. She looked at me with a neutral expression of someone accustomed to unusual situations. "Miss Reyes," she said. "I'm Teresa. If you'll follow me." I followed her through a marble foyer, past rooms filled with furniture that belonged in museums, up a curved staircase with an iron railing, down a hallway lined with closed doors. She opened the last door on the left. "You'll stay here tonight. The bathroom is through that door. You'll find everything you need. Someone will bring you something to eat if you're hungry." I stepped into a bedroom larger than my entire apartment. A four-poster bed with white linens. A sitting area with chairs upholstered in gray velvet. Windows that overlooked grounds I couldn't see in the darkness. "Am I locked in?" I asked. Teresa's expression softened slightly. "No, Miss Reyes. But I wouldn't recommend wandering. The house is complicated at night." She left, closing the door with a soft click. I stood in the center of the room, heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. I'd been taken, kidnapped, disappeared. And yet the room was beautiful. The bed looked comfortable. There were fresh flowers on the dresser, white roses, their scent subtle and expensive. No ropes, no locks, no obvious restraints, just watchers and walls, and the clear understanding that I was no longer in control of my own life. I didn't sleep, couldn't even consider it. I paced the room, examined every corner, checked the windows, locked, 3-story drop, tested the door, unlocked, just as Teresa had said. I found a bathroom stocked with luxury toiletries and towels softer than anything I'd ever owned. A closet with hangers and nothing else. Someone had brought a tray of food, bread, cheese, fruit, water. I didn't touch it. Around 3 in the morning, I finally sat in one of the velvet chairs and watched the darkness outside slowly give way to gray pre-dawn light. That's when the door opened. I jerked upright, pulse spiking. Mateo Navarro stepped inside. He looked the same as he had at the restaurant. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly in control. But here, in this space that clearly belonged to him, his authority was absolute. He didn't need to announce it. The walls did it for him. He closed the door and studied me for a long moment. "You didn't eat," he observed. I said nothing. He crossed to the window, hands in his pockets, and looked out at the grounds. "You left your phone on the sidewalk. And your bag. Why?" "So someone would know I didn't leave willingly." "No one's looking for you, Isabella." The casual cruelty of it, the truth of it, stole my breath. He turned to face me. "You have no family. No close friends. Your landlord won't notice you're gone until rent is late. Your employer will assume you quit without notice." He paused. "You've made yourself invisible. That was smart for a while. But it also means you're easy to erase." Tears burned behind my eyes. I refused to let them fall. "What do you want from me?" "Answers," he said simply. "About your grandmother. About the words you know. About who you really are." "I already told you. You told me fragments. Pieces of truth wrapped in careful omissions." He moved closer, not threatening, just closing the distance between us. "I've spent the last 6 hours learning everything I can about Isabella Reyes. It's not much. You appeared in Boston 3 years ago with a social security number, and not much else. You worked, you kept to yourself, you vanished. Then you appeared in New York 6 months ago, and repeated the pattern. My blood ran cold. You had no right. I have every right to protect what's mine. I'm not yours." "No," he agreed, his voice dropping to something softer and infinitely more dangerous. "You're not my prisoner, Isabella." He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. "You're my responsibility." The word hung between us like a sentence. "There's a difference," he continued. "A prisoner wants to escape. A responsibility needs to be protected from others, from herself, from truths she doesn't understand yet. I don't need your protection. You do. You just don't know why yet." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. Old, faded, the edges worn. He held it out to me. I took it with shaking hands. The photograph showed 2 men standing in front of a stone building. Sicily from the architecture. They were young, maybe in their 20s, arms around each other's shoulders. One of them was smiling. "The man on the left," Mateo said quietly, "is my father. Taken in Corleone, 1987. My eyes moved to the second man. I knew that face. Not from memory. I'd never met him. But I'd seen it in my grandmother's eyes every time she told stories about the husband she'd lost. The man who'd been murdered for refusing to betray a powerful family. The man on the right, Matteo continued, watching my face, is Salvatore Rossi. Your grandfather. The photograph slipped from my fingers. You're not just some waitress who happened to overhear a Sicilian phrase, I sabla. His voice was velvet and steel. You're the granddaughter of a man who died keeping my family secrets. He crouched down, retrieved the photograph, and placed it on the table beside me. Your grandmother was Lucia Rossi. She fled Sicily with you in her arms after your grandfather's murder. Changed her name. Changed yours. Hid you in Boston and then New York, moving every few years to stay invisible. He knew. He knew everything. She died 6 months ago, he said gently. And the protections she built around you died with her. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. There are people who remember your grandfather's name, Isabella. People who never forgot that he took secrets to his grave. People who would very much like to know if he told those secrets to his family before he died. Matteo's eyes held mine. That's why you're here. Not because I want to hurt you. Because the moment you spoke those words in front of my men, you painted a target on yourself that I can't erase. He stood, smoothing his jacket. So no, you're not my prisoner. But you're not leaving either. Not until I figure out what you know, who sent you, and how to keep you alive long enough to matter. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Welcome to my world, Isabella Reyes. Or should I call you Isabella Rossi? He left before I could answer. Before I could process what he'd just said. Before I could reconcile the truth I'd been running for my entire life with the cage I'd just stepped into. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was a ghost of someone else's past. And Matteo Navarro knew exactly who haunted me. The man on the left, Matteo said quietly, is my father. Taken in Corleone, 1987. My eyes moved to the second man. I knew that face. Not from memory. I'd never met him. But I'd seen it in my grandmother's eyes every time she told stories about the husband she'd lost. The man who'd been murdered for refusing to betray a powerful family. The man on the right, Matteo continued, watching my face, is Salvatore Rossi. Your grandfather. The photograph slipped from my fingers. You're not just some waitress who happened to overhear a Sicilian phrase, Isabella. His voice was velvet and steel. You're the granddaughter of a man who died keeping my family secrets. He crouched down, retrieved the photograph, and placed it on the table beside me. Your grandmother was Lucia Rossi. She fled Sicily with you in her arms after your grandfather's murder. Changed her name. Changed yours. Hid you in Boston and then New York, moving every few years to stay invisible. He knew. He knew everything. She died 6 months ago, he said gently. And the protections she built around you died with her. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. There are people who remember your grandfather's name, Isabella. People who never forgot that he took secrets to his grave. People who would very much like to know if he told those secrets to his family before he died. Matteo's eyes held mine. That's why you're here. Not because I want to hurt you. Because the moment you spoke those words in front of my men, you painted a target on yourself that I can't erase. He stood, smoothing his jacket. So no, you're not my prisoner. But you're not leaving either. Not until I figure out what you know, who sent you, and how to keep you alive long enough to matter. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Welcome to my world, Isabella Reyes. Or should I call you Isabella Rossi? He left before I could answer. Before I could process what he'd just said. Before I could reconcile the truth I'd been running for my entire life with the cage I'd just stepped into. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was a ghost of someone else's past. And Matteo Navarro knew exactly who haunted me. I didn't move for a long time after Matteo left. Just sat in the velvet chair, staring at the photograph on the table beside me. 2 young men in Sicily, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling like they had their whole lives ahead of them. One of them had built an empire. The other had died to protect it. And I was the ghost caught between them. Isabella Rossi. The name felt foreign in my mind. I'd been Isabella Reyes my entire life, or at least the life I could remember. But my grandmother had called me Piccola Rosa when she thought I wasn't listening. Little Rose. A name that belonged to a past she'd tried to bury. I picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. My grandfather's face stared back at me, frozen in time. Young and handsome, with dark hair and eyes that held the same wariness I saw in my own mirror. He had his hand on Matteo's father's shoulder, the gesture easy and familiar. Brothers, maybe not by blood, but by something deeper. Cosa Nostra. Our thing. Our life. The phrase my grandmother had whispered 1,000 times, always with her eyes closed, always like a prayer for the dead. The sun was fully up when Teresa returned. She carried a tray with coffee and pastries, setting it on the table without comment. She'd changed into a different outfit, dark gray today, perfectly pressed, but her expression remained the same. Neutral. Professional. The look of someone who'd seen too many unexpected guests in this house to be surprised by one more. Mr. Navarro would like to speak with you, she said. When you're ready. And if I'm not ready? Teresa's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. He'll wait. But not forever. She left as quietly as she'd arrived. I poured coffee I didn't want and stared at pastries I couldn't eat. My stomach was a knot of anxiety and exhaustion, and something else I didn't want to name. Fear, yes. But also a strange, terrible curiosity. Matteo knew things about my family that I'd never been told. Things my grandmother had taken to her grave, leaving me with fragments and half-truths and warnings I never understood. Don't trust men who smile too easily, Piccola. Don't speak the old words where strangers can hear. And never, ever go back to Sicily. I'd thought she was being paranoid. A traumatized old woman who'd lost her husband and fled her home, who saw danger in every shadow. Now I realized she'd been giving me a survival manual for a war I hadn't known I was part of. I drank the coffee. It was perfect, rich, and strong, and exactly the way I liked it, which meant Matteo had been paying attention, even to details that small. The thought unsettled me more than the locked gates or the watching guards. I found him in a study on the second floor. Teresa had led me through hallways lined with artwork that belonged in galleries, past windows overlooking grounds that stretched beyond sight. The house was beautiful in daylight, all pale stone and high ceilings and the kind of quiet that only money could buy. But it was still a cage. Matteo sat behind a massive desk, reading something on a laptop. He'd changed clothes, dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scattered with scars. He looked up when I entered, closing the laptop with a soft click. Isabla. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. I remained standing. I'd rather not. It wasn't a request. We stared at each other across the desk. A battle of wills that we both knew he'd win eventually, but I needed him to understand that I wouldn't surrender easily. Finally, I sat. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with that unnerving focus. Tell me about your grandmother.
Why?
You already know everything. I know facts. Dates and names and places. I know Lucia Rossi fled Corleone in 1989 with a 3-year-old granddaughter. I know she changed both your names and moved through 6 different cities before settling in Boston.
He paused.
What I don't know is what she told you, what she taught you, what she was preparing you for. She wasn't preparing me for anything. She was just scared. Of what? I looked away, toward the windows. Beyond the grounds, I could see the edge of a forest, trees still holding the last of their autumn leaves. Of men like you, I said quietly. Matteo was silent for a moment. Then he stood, moving to a cabinet against the wall. He poured 2 glasses of something amber, whiskey, probably, and brought one to me. I didn't take it. He set it on the desk within reach and returned to his chair. Start at the beginning, he said. Tell me what she told you about Sicily. The memories came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. I told him about the tiny apartment in Boston where my grandmother and I had lived. How she'd spoken to me in Italian and Sicilian, refusing to let me forget the language even though we lived in America now. How she'd cooked the old recipes, filling our cramped kitchen with the smells of Sicily, tomatoes and basil and bread that tasted like home. How she'd told me stories. Not the nice kind. Not fairy tales about princes and happy endings. Stories about men who kept their word even when it cost them everything. About women who learned to read silence like other people read books. About families bound by oaths older than countries, deeper than law. She never said mafia. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She never used that word.
It was always la famiglia.
The family, like it was something sacred. Matteo listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. She told me about my grandfather when I was old enough to understand. How he'd been a good man, an honorable man. How he'd kept his promises even when powerful people wanted him to break them. What promises? I met his gaze. She never said. Just that he'd been asked to betray someone he'd sworn to protect. And when he refused, they killed him for it. Who killed him? I don't know. She wouldn't say. Every time I asked, she'd just. I swallowed hard, remembering. She'd close her eyes and whisper the oath. A vita e cosa nostra. Like it was the only prayer that mattered. Matteo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She told me the oath was protection. I continued. That as long as I remembered it, as long as I carried it with me, I'd be safe. That the people who mattered would know I belonged to something bigger than myself. And you believed her? I was a child. I believed everything she told me. I picked up the glass of whiskey he'd poured, turning it in my hands without drinking. When I got older, I thought she was just traumatized. Living in the past. I thought the oath was just words. Something to make her feel safe when nothing else did. But you kept saying it. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. When I was scared. When I felt alone. It became a habit. I struggled to find the words. Like carrying a piece of her with me. Matteo stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. His silhouette was sharp against the light, all clean lines and controlled power. Your grandfather saved my father's life, he said quietly. 1987, there was a dispute. Internal. Someone close to my father had been selling information to a rival family. When they came for him, it was your grandfather who stood between them. I stopped breathing.
He wasn't supposed to be there that night.
He was just delivering a message. But when the shooting started, he didn't run. Matteo's voice was soft, almost reverent. He put himself between my father and 3 men with guns. Took 2 bullets. Survived long enough to identify the traitor. He turned to face me. My father swore a debt that night. To Salvatore Rossi and his bloodline. Protection. Resources. A life for a life. His dark eyes held mine. 2 years later, your grandfather was dead. Murdered by the same people who'd wanted my father gone. And my father couldn't save him. The room felt too small suddenly. Too warm.
Why?
I whispered. Why didn't he protect him? If there was an oath. Because your grandmother ran. Matteo's voice was gentle but firm. She took you and disappeared before my father even knew your grandfather was dead. By the time he found out, you were already gone. He searched for years. Had people looking in every city, every country where Sicilian families settled. He moved closer until he was standing directly in front of me. He died still looking for you, Isabella. Still carrying the weight of that unpaid debt.
He paused.
And then you walked into my restaurant and spoke the words that only your family should know. The words my father taught your grandfather. The oath that bound them. Tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. I didn't know. I breathed. I swear I didn't know any of this. I believe you. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. The touch was gentle, almost tender, and completely at odds with the dangerous man I knew him to be. But that doesn't change what you are, he continued. The granddaughter of a man who died protecting my family. The last of a bloodline that my father swore to protect. So, what does that make me to you? My voice cracked. An obligation? A debt to be paid. Matteo's expression shifted into something I couldn't read. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I'm going to find out. He called a meeting that afternoon. I heard them arriving, cars on the gravel drive, voices in the foyer, the sound of men who were used to command and control. Teresa appeared to escort me downstairs, her face carefully neutral. Where are we going? I asked. Mr. Navarro wants to introduce you. The words sent ice through my veins. To who? His people. She led me to a room I hadn't seen before, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather chairs and windows overlooking the grounds. 8 men stood in a loose circle, all of them dressed like they'd just left boardrooms or courtrooms or places where power was traded like currency. They turned when I entered. I recognized some of them from the restaurant. The silver-haired man with the scar. The guard who'd been watching me. Others were strangers, but they all had the same look. Sharp eyes, careful postures, the alertness of men who'd survived by noticing everything. Matteo stood near the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Gentlemen, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. This is Isabella Rossi, granddaughter of Salvatore Rossi, who some of you are old enough to remember. The silver-haired man's eyes widened slightly. A few others exchanged glances. She's under my protection, Matteo continued, each word deliberate and final. Effective immediately. He moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him. No one touches her. No one questions her. No one discusses her presence or her identity outside this house. His gaze swept the room, landing on each man in turn. She is Famiglia. My responsibility. My decision. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave now. No one moved.
Good.
Matteo's hand settled on my lower back, possessive, protective, a public claim that made my skin burn. Isabella, these are the men who run my operations. You'll see them around the estate. They answer to me, which means they answer to you by extension. I don't want anyone answering to me, I said quietly. His fingers pressed slightly harder against my spine. That's not your choice to make. The men filed out one by one, each of them nodding to Matteo, some of them casting curious glances at me. The silver-haired man paused at the door. Salvatore was a good man, he said, his voice rough with memory. It's good to see his line continues. Then he was gone, and I was alone with Matteo. I stepped away from his touch, putting distance between us. What was that? Protection. That was a declaration of ownership. It's the same thing in my world. He set down his glass. Those men needed to understand that you're not a prisoner, or a guest, or leverage. You're under my direct protection, which makes you untouchable. I didn't ask for that. You don't have to ask. It's already done. He moved closer, inexorable. This is how it works, Isabella. I make decisions that keep you safe, and you accept them. I'm not a child who needs decisions made for her.
No.
His eyes darkened. You're a woman who's been running her entire life without knowing what she was running from. A woman whose grandmother died still looking over her shoulder, still terrified that the past would catch up. He stopped inches away. Well, it caught up. But instead of destroying you, it brought you here.
To me.
To the one place you might actually be safe. Safe, I repeated, the word bitter in my mouth. Is that what you call this? Being taken from my home, kept in a house I can't leave, paraded in front of your men like property. I call it staying alive. His voice dropped to something softer, more dangerous. There are people who would kill you just for bearing your grandfather's name. People who still wonder what secret Salvatore took to his grave. The moment you spoke that oath in front of my men, you became visible to those people. He reached out and caught my chin, tilting my face up to his. So yes, I'm keeping you here. Yes, I'm making decisions about your safety without your input. Yes, I'm claiming you in front of men who need to understand that touching you means war. His thumb brushed across my jaw. Because the alternative is finding you dead in an alley somewhere, and I won't let my father's debt die unpaid. I pulled away from his touch, even though part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to lean into it. This isn't protection, Matteo. It's possession. In my world, he said quietly, they're the same thing. He left me alone after that. Teresa appeared to escort me back to my room, where I spent the rest of the day staring out windows at grounds I couldn't explore, thinking about grandparents I'd never known, about oaths that bound the dead to the living, about a man who died protecting Matteo's father, about a woman who'd spent 30 years running to keep her granddaughter safe, about the cage I was in now, gilded and beautiful and absolutely inescapable. Dinner arrived on a tray, food I didn't eat, wine I didn't drink. When darkness fell, I finally understood what my grandmother had been so afraid of. Not death, but this. Being known, being claimed, being drawn into a world where protection and possession were the same word, spoken in different tones. Where safety meant surrendering freedom. Where the only way to survive was to belong to someone powerful enough to keep you alive. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and whispered the oath my grandmother had taught me. A vita e cosa nostra. Our life. Our thing. But whose life was it now? Mine? Or the ghost of a dead man's promise, come to collect a debt I never agreed to pay? Outside, I saw Matteo walking the grounds, hands in his pockets, flanked by 2 guards who kept a respectful distance. Even from here, even in darkness, I could feel the weight of his authority. He stopped and looked up at my window, found me watching, and the recognition in his gaze, the certainty that I belonged to him now, whether I accepted it or not, made my breath catch. Protection felt dangerously like ownership, and I was beginning to realize they might be the exact same thing. 3 days passed before Matteo let me out of the room. Not confined. Teresa reminded me daily that the door was unlocked, that I could move through the house if I wished. But the unspoken boundaries were clear. The estate was large, but it was still a cage. The grounds were beautiful, but guards walked the perimeter. I was protected, claimed, owned in every way that mattered. On the 4th day, everything changed. I was reading in the library, one of the few spaces Teresa had indicated I was welcome, when voices drifted in from the adjacent room. Not loud, but distinct enough to pull my attention from the book I wasn't really absorbing anyway. Men. 4 or 5 of them, based on the different tones. Speaking in Italian with the clipped efficiency of people who didn't waste words. I should have left. Should have respected the privacy of whatever business Matteo was conducting. Instead, I stayed very still and listened. Old habit. My grandmother had taught me that survival meant paying attention, not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. To the pauses between words, the shifts in tone, the things that lived in silence. Women like us, piccola, we survive by noticing what powerful men think we're too simple to understand. The shipment arrives Thursday, one voice said. Deep, authoritative. Matteo. Confirmation came this morning. And the route. Another voice. Older, familiar, the silver-haired man with the scar. His name was Luca, I'd learned. Matteo's second. Same as last time. Through the port, then overland. Carlo's handling the logistics. A third voice spoke up. Younger, eager. Carlo's been reliable. No issues with the last 3 shipments. Reliability is easy when there's no pressure, Matteo said. Let's see how he handles complications. They moved on to other topics, financial reports, territory disputes, names and numbers that meant nothing to me. I was about to close my book and leave when something made me pause. The younger voice again. I'll coordinate with Carlo directly. Make sure everything's in place for Thursday. No. Matteo's response was immediate. Luca handles Carlo. That's the chain of command. Of course. I just meant. I know what you meant, Marco. The answer is no. Silence. The kind that felt weighted, significant. Then the conversation moved on, and moments later, the meeting broke up. I heard footsteps, doors opening and closing, the house settling back into its usual quiet. I sat very still, staring at the book in my lap, without seeing it. Something about that exchange bothered me. A discordant note in an otherwise routine conversation. But I couldn't identify what, exactly, had triggered the unease. The next day, I watched from the second-floor landing as Matteo held another meeting in the formal dining room. The doors were open, not an invitation, but not explicitly forbidden either. I could see them gathered around the long table. 8 men, including Matteo at the head. I recognized most of them from the introduction in the library.
Luca, the guards.
And Marco, the younger man with the eager voice from yesterday's meeting. He sat 3 seats down from Matteo, taking notes on a tablet. Attentive, professional, exactly what a loyal subordinate should be. But something about the way he watched Matteo bothered me. Not the obvious deference that the others showed. Not fear or respect or even wariness. Something else. Something that looked almost like anticipation. I moved closer to the railing, staying in shadow. They were discussing the Thursday shipment again. Logistics, timing, personnel. Matteo delegated tasks with quiet authority, and each man acknowledged their role with nods or brief confirmations. Except Marco. Every time Matteo spoke, Marco's fingers moved across his tablet. Not unusual, he was taking notes. But twice, I saw his thumb move to the side of the device. A small gesture, almost invisible. The kind of gesture someone makes when sending a message. You're being paranoid, I told myself.
You don't know these people. You don't understand how they operate.
But my grandmother's voice whispered in my memory. Trust your instincts, Piccola. They're the only thing that can't be bought or broken. I found Matteo in his study that evening. He was alone, reviewing documents on his laptop, a glass of whiskey within reach. He looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across his features before settling back into his usual controlled expression. I sabla. He closed the laptop. Do you need something? I hesitated at the threshold. I'd barely spoken to him since the meeting with his men 3 days ago. Had actively avoided him. Actually, still unsettled by the way he'd claimed me in front of them. But this was more important than my discomfort. I need to tell you something, I said. About Marco. Matteo's expression didn't change, but I felt the quality of his attention shift. Sharpen. Come in. Close the door. I did, then crossed to stand in front of his desk. Being this close to him still made my pulse quicken. Part fear, part something I refused to examine. What about Marco? He asked. He's messaging someone during your meetings. On his tablet. I saw him do it twice today. Matteo leaned back in his chair, studying me. You were watching my meeting. I was on the landing. The doors were open. I met his gaze. Should I have not been there? That depends on why you were watching. Because I was bored and restless and tired of being locked in this house with nothing to do but think. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. But that's not the point. Marco is sending messages to someone while you're discussing shipment details. Don't you think that's strange? Marco is my communications coordinator. Sending messages is his job. During closed meetings? Without telling you who he's messaging or why. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, moving around the desk to lean against the front edge, closer to me. What exactly did you see? I recounted both meetings, the conversation I'd overheard in the library, the way Marco had tried to insert himself into the chain of command, the way he watched Matteo during today's meeting, the small, surreptitious movements of his thumb against the tablet. It might be nothing, I admitted. I don't know your business or how these things normally work, but it felt wrong, like he was playing a role instead of just doing his job. Matteo said nothing for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on my face with that unnerving intensity. You noticed all of that from watching 2 meetings, he finally said. It wasn't a question. My grandmother taught me to pay attention, to read what people aren't saying. I crossed my arms, suddenly self-conscious. She said powerful men always underestimate women who stay quiet, that we survive by seeing what they think we're too simple to notice. Something shifted in Matteo's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Your grandmother was a smart woman. She was a terrified woman who spent 30 years looking over her shoulder. But yes, she was smart. I paused. Are you going to look into Marco or not? I'm going to do more than look into him. Matteo pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then set it aside. But first, I want you to tell me everything else you've noticed about my men. Every small thing that seemed off. Every instinct you've had since you arrived. We talked for over an hour. I told him about the guard who'd been at my door the second night, but not the third. About how Luca's tone changed when discussing certain shipments. About the way two of the younger men deferred to each other before responding to Matteo's questions, like they were checking silent signals. Matteo listened without interrupting, his focus absolute. Occasionally, he'd ask a clarifying question or make a note on his phone, but mostly, he just absorbed everything I said with the patience of someone who understood that intelligence came from unexpected sources. When I finally ran out of observations, he stood and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. This time, when he offered me one, I took it. Marco's been with me for 18 months, Matteo said, returning to lean against the desk. Came highly recommended. Efficient, loyal, smart. I've had no reason to question him. And now I'm questioning everything. He sipped his whiskey, eyes distant. There's been a leak somewhere in my organization. Small things at first, shipments that arrived late, meetings that got interrupted by convenient emergencies. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to be irritating. You think Marco's the leak? I think you've given me a direction to look that I hadn't considered. He studied me over the rim of his glass. How did your grandmother teach you to read people like this? I looked away, toward the darkened windows. She used to take me to cafes when I was young. We'd sit for hours, and she'd point out different people. The businessman who was lying to his wife on the phone. The waiter who was stealing from the register. The woman who was afraid of the man she was with. I took a drink, the whiskey burning down my throat. She'd make me watch and guess what I was seeing. Then she'd explain what she'd noticed. Body language, micro-expressions, the things people do when they're pretending. She called it survival training. She was preparing you for this world, Matteo said quietly. Even if she never told you that's what she was doing. Maybe. Or maybe she was just teaching her granddaughter how to recognize danger before it was too late. The way she hadn't been able to with my grandfather. Thursday arrived with cold rain and gray skies. I was in the library again when the commotion started. Raised voices from somewhere downstairs. The sound of cars on the gravel drive.
Doors slamming.
Teresa appeared in the doorway, her face tight with tension. Miss Reyes.
You need to come with me. Now.
My stomach dropped. What happened? Just come. Quickly. She led me through the house at a pace just short of running, down to the first floor and into a room I'd never been in before, some kind of security center, with monitors showing different views of the estate and beyond. Matteo stood in front of the screens, flanked by Luca and 3 guards I didn't recognize. They were all watching the same feed, a warehouse somewhere, the image grainy but clear enough to show figures moving in the shadows. When Matteo's voice was ice. 20 minutes ago, Luca said. They hit the shipment before it even reached the port. Knew exactly when and where it would be vulnerable. Casualties. 3 of ours wounded. 2 of theirs dead. The rest scattered when our backup arrived. Matteo's jaw tightened. Marco. Can't reach him. Phone's off. I understood then. The leak. The Thursday shipment. Marco's messages during the meetings. I'd been right. Matteo turned and saw me standing in the doorway with Teresa. For a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. Relief, maybe, or recognition. Then his expression hardened back into command. Luca. Find Marco. I want him alive, but I don't particularly care what condition he's in when you bring him to me. He paused. And find out who he's been messaging. I want names, locations, every contact he's had in the past 6 months. On it. Luca left with 2 of the guards. The remaining men shifted uncomfortably, sensing the fury radiating off Matteo despite his controlled exterior. He looked at each of them in turn. Someone vouched for Marco when I hired him. Someone in this organization gave him credibility. I want to know who, and I want to know if it was incompetence or collaboration. They nodded, murmuring acknowledgments, then filed out until only Matteo and I remained in the room. The silence stretched between us, filled with the soft hum of electronics and the rain against the windows. You were right, he finally said, not looking at me. 3 men are in the hospital because I didn't listen fast enough. You couldn't have known. I should have known. He turned to face me, and the raw anger in his eyes made me step back. Not directed at me, but still dangerous in its intensity. I should have seen what you saw in 2 days. I should have questioned him the moment you brought him to my attention instead of running background checks first. Matteo, you saved lives tonight, Isabella. If we hadn't moved our backup earlier based on your warning, we'd have lost more than 3 wounded. He moved closer, each step deliberate. You see things my own men miss. Notice patterns that people trained for this work don't catch. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. Your grandmother didn't just teach you to survive, he said quietly. She taught you to see the truth through the lies. To read the silence between words. That's not a common skill. That's a weapon. I don't want to be a weapon. Too late. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone. You already are. The only question is whether you're my weapon or someone else's. I'm not anyone's. You're mine, Isabella. We established that already. His voice dropped lower, softer, infinitely more dangerous. But now you're not just my responsibility. You're my asset. My advantage. The thing my enemies won't see coming, because they'll underestimate you the same way I almost did. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my temple. And tomorrow, when I deal with Marco, you're going to be there. You're going to watch what happens to people who betray me. Because you need to understand what world you're part of now. Then he stepped back, releasing me, leaving me cold where his hand had been. Get some rest, he said, returning his attention to the monitors. Tomorrow is going to be educational. I left on shaking legs, Teresa appearing to escort me back to my room. But I didn't rest. I lay awake in the darkness, replaying the moment Matteo had called me his weapon. His asset. His advantage. Not his prisoner. Not his responsibility. His. The power dynamic had shifted. I felt it like a change in air pressure before a storm. I was no longer just the granddaughter of a dead man, protected out of obligation. I was valuable, essential, dangerous in my own right, and I didn't know if that made me safer or infinitely more trapped. He came to my room near midnight. I was still awake, still dressed, standing by the window when I heard the soft knock. Come in, I said, not turning around. The door opened and closed. Footsteps on the carpet. Then Matteo's presence at my back, close but not touching. Can't sleep, he asked. Can you?
No.
He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to ask you something.
What?
Tomorrow, when I question Marco, I need you there not just as a witness, but as a reader. I need you to tell me if he's lying, if he's holding something back, if there are details he's trying to hide. I turned to face him. In the low light from the bedside lamp, his features were all shadow and sharp angles. You're asking me to help you interrogate someone. I'm asking you to use your skills to protect what's mine, including yourself.
His eyes held mine.
There are more Marcos out there, Isabella. More people who want to destroy what I've built. And if they find out you exist, they'll come for you to get to me. So, I read people for you. Notice things your trained men don't, and in exchange you keep me alive?
No.
He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of him. You do those things because you're brilliant at them. Because your grandmother gave you a gift that shouldn't be wasted. Because you're not content to sit in pretty rooms and be protected like fragile glass. His hand came up to my face again, that same gesture from earlier, tender despite the calluses on his palm. I keep you alive because the alternative is unacceptable, he continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Because you're the last piece of my father's greatest debt. Because you see too much, know too much, matter too much to let the world take you from me. Matteo. Say yes, Isabella. Tell me you'll stand with me tomorrow. Tell me you'll use that sharp mind and those careful eyes to help me root out the rot in my organization. I should have said no. Should have refused to be drawn deeper into his world of violence and loyalty and debts that span generations. But I thought about Marco's surreptitious messages, about the 3 men in the hospital, about all the ways this world would swallow me whole whether I participated or not. At least this way, I'd have some control. Yes, I whispered. I'll help you. The smile that crossed his face was small, private, and absolutely devastating.
Good.
He leaned in and pressed his lips to my forehead, a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss. Sleep now. Tomorrow you stop being just mine to protect. He left before I could respond, the door clicking softly behind him. I stood in the empty room, fingers pressed to my forehead where his lips had been, and realized the cage had just gotten bigger. But the bars were still there. I'd just agreed to help forge them myself. The estate settled into its nocturnal rhythms around midnight, guards changing shifts, lights dimming in distant wings, the soft click of locks being engaged. I'd learned these patterns over the past 3 weeks, the way a prisoner learns the architecture of her cell. Except I wasn't a prisoner anymore. That realization had come slowly, like dawn breaking over the Mediterranean. The men no longer followed me from room to room. Matteo's housekeeper, Rosa, had stopped hovering. Yesterday, I'd walked through the front gates to the garden, and no one had stopped me. I could have kept walking down the long drive toward the main road, toward freedom. I'd turned back after 10 minutes. Not because of the guards I knew were watching from their positions. Not because of some misplaced sense of loyalty or Stockholm syndrome. But because the world outside these walls felt more dangerous than the one within them. Because I'd warned Matteo about the traitor in his organization 2 days ago, and he'd looked at me not with suspicion, but with something that looked almost like respect. Because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, fear had transmuted into something far more complicated. I stood at the window of my suite. No longer a room, but a suite, with antique furniture and silk curtains and a view of the grounds that stretched toward the hills, watching the moon paint silver across the olive groves. I wore the nightgown Rosa had left on my bed, soft cotton instead of the practical t-shirts I'd brought from my apartment. Another small erosion of the person I'd been. A knock came at my door. Not the sharp rap of a guard, but something gentler. I knew who it was before I opened it. Matteo stood in the hallway, still dressed in his shirt and trousers from dinner, though he'd removed his jacket and tie. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and there was a tiredness around his eyes I'd started to recognize, the weight of a man who never truly rests. "You're still awake," he said. "So are you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I saw your light on. I thought." He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "May I come in?" It should have been a threat, the most dangerous man I'd ever met asking to enter my room at midnight. But something in his voice sounded almost uncertain, almost human. I stepped back, opening the door wider. He entered slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he moved to the window, standing where I'd been standing, looking out at the same view. "I can't sleep in this house," he said quietly. "Haven't been able to for years. Too many rooms. Too much silence." "Then why do you stay here?" "Because silence is safer than noise. Emptiness is safer than fullness." He turned to face me, and in the moonlight, his features looked softer, less carved from marble. "My father built this estate to house a family. 3 generations under one roof. He imagined grandchildren running through these halls, holidays filled with voices and laughter." His jaw tightened. "He died in the library downstairs. Shot twice in the chest by a man he'd trusted for 20 years. The confession hung in the air between us. I moved closer, drawn by the rawness in his voice. "How old were you?" 19. Old enough to inherit. Too young to know what that inheritance would cost. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if seeing blood there. "I killed the traitor myself. Made him kneel in the same spot where my father fell. And I've been filling this house with silence ever since." "Because you're afraid," I said softly. His eyes snapped to mine, sharp with warning. "I'm not afraid of anything."
No.
I took another step closer. "You're afraid of everything. That's why you control it all. Why you notice every detail. Why you couldn't let me leave." I held his gaze. "You're terrified that if you let your guard down for even a moment, someone will take from you the way they took your father." The silence stretched so long I thought he might leave, might retreat behind the cold mask he wore like armor. Instead, he laughed a low, bitter sound. You see too much, Isabla Reyes. You made me essential, remember? I'm supposed to notice things. I made you essential because you're brilliant, he said, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. Because you decoded a conversation in 15 minutes that my best analysts couldn't parse in 3 days. Because you warned me about Antonio before my own security team suspected him. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell cedar and smoke. Because you speak the old words and carry a bloodline I thought was dead, and you're either the greatest threat I've ever encountered or you're exactly what I didn't know I needed. The words landed between us like a match struck in a room full of gasoline. My heart hammered against my ribs. What are you saying, Matteo? I'm saying I don't know what to do with you. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Every instinct I have tells me to let you go. To give you money, a new identity, a life far from this world. But every time I try to make that decision, I find myself at your door at midnight, looking for... He trailed off, something like frustration crossing his features. Looking for what? Company. Conversation. His eyes held mine. You. The confession felt more dangerous than any threat he'd made. Tell me something, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. That first night in the car, you said you'd decide if I was a threat or an asset. Which did you decide? Neither. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered at my jaw, warm against my skin. I decided you were inevitable. I should have stepped back. Should have maintained the distance that kept this manageable, kept it safe. Instead, I leaned into his touch. My grandmother used to say that some people are written into your fate, I whispered. That you can run from them your whole life, but eventually the story catches up. Do you believe that? I didn't. Not until I stood in that dining room and spoke words I shouldn't have known, to a man I shouldn't have met. I searched his face, memorizing the sharp angles softened by moonlight. Now I don't know what I believe. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone. I believe in what I can control. Loyalty bought and enforced. Power secured through strategy and ruthlessness. His voice roughened. I don't believe in fate or destiny or any force beyond my command. But you, Isabla, you're making me question every principle I've built my life on. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's dangerous. Everything about you is dangerous. And yet you're still here. So are you. The conversation had become something else. Not words, but a negotiation, a dance around the gravity pulling us together. Matteo's hand slid from my face to my neck, his palm warm against my pulse. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice rough. Tell me this crosses a line. What if I don't want you to leave? Something broke in his expression, some final wall crumbling. He leaned in slowly, his forehead resting against mine, giving me 1,000 chances to pull away. I didn't. His lips met mine with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about him. No claiming, no possession, just a question asked in the oldest language. I answered by pressing closer, my hands finding his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath my palms. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate and achingly careful all at once. His hand tangled in my hair. My fingers gripped his shirt. And for a moment, the world outside this room, the danger, the violence, the impossible situation we'd found ourselves in, ceased to exist. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matteo pressed his lips to my forehead, holding me against him like I might disappear. This is a mistake, he murmured against my hair. Probably. I don't make mistakes. There's a first time for everything. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his dark eyes searching mine. I was raised to destroy what I love before it destroys me. It's the only way to survive in this world. Do you understand what that means? My throat tightened. It means you've never let yourself love anything. It means I don't know how to do this without ruining it. I cupped his face in my hands, forcing him to hold my gaze. Then we'll figure it out together. Or we'll ruin it together. Either way, I'm not running. You should. But I won't. For a long moment, he just stared at me, as if trying to decode a language he'd never learned. Then he kissed me again, slower this time, more deliberate, like he was memorizing the shape of this moment. When he finally left, close to 2 in the morning, the air in my room felt charged with something I couldn't name. I touched my lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss, and wondered if I'd just crossed a threshold I could never return from. The next morning, Rosa found me in the garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the olive trees. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She sat beside me without invitation, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "You're getting comfortable here," she said in Spanish, her tone neutral. "Is that a problem?" "That depends on what you think comfort means." She turned to look at me, and her expression held something between pity and warning. "I've worked for the Navarro family for 38 years. I served Mateo's father. I raised Mateo after his mother left. I've seen what this life does to people. Then you've seen that Mateo is different from his father." "Different." Rosa's laugh was dry.
No, Nina.
"He's exactly like his father. Strong, brilliant, loyal to a fault, and utterly incapable of loving anything without making it his to control." The words landed like stones in my stomach. "His father loved his wife," Rosa continued. "Loved her so completely that when she left, it nearly destroyed him. So he did what men like them do. He buried himself in business, in power, in building an empire that could never leave him." She met my eyes. "Mateo watched that. Learned from it. He swore he'd never make himself that vulnerable. People change." "Do they?" Rosa's smile was sad. "Or do they just find new ways to cage what they love?" I thought about the guards I no longer noticed. The way Mateo knew where I was at all times. How he'd place me in his home, his world, until leaving felt impossible. "Men like Mateo don't fall in love, Isabella," Rosa said gently. "They claim. They possess. They wrap their protection around you until you can't tell the difference between safety and captivity." She stood, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. "I just hope you know what you're choosing." She walked back toward the house, leaving me alone beneath the olive trees. I sat there for a long time, my fingers touching my lips, remembering the taste of his kiss. And I realized with cold, creeping certainty, Rosa was right. I wasn't choosing anymore. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, between the surveillance and the late-night conversations, between the danger and the protection, between fear and this dangerous, complicated feeling blooming in my chest, I'd already been claimed. The only question that remained was whether I'd chosen it, or whether that choice had been made for me the moment I whispered those 3 words in front of Mateo Navarro. "A vita e cosa nostra." Life is ours. But whose life? And who owned it now? I looked up at the estate, its windows gleaming in the morning sun, and saw Mateo standing at his office window, watching me. Always watching. I should have felt trapped. Instead, I lifted my hand in a small wave. He didn't wave back. But he didn't look away either. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from standing at the edge of a cliff, that whatever happened next, whether this was love or possession, partnership or captivity, I was already too far gone to turn back. The fall had already begun. All that remained was to see where I'd land. The estate had never felt so small. For weeks it had been a gilded cage, vast corridors, marble floors that echoed every footstep, windows overlooking manicured gardens that stretched toward the distant hills. I had learned its rhythms, the quiet mornings when Mateo took his coffee alone on the terrace, the afternoons when his lieutenants arrived in sleek black cars, the evenings when the house settled into a watchful hush. I had learned to move through it like a ghost, listening more than speaking, seeing more than I was meant to see. But now the walls seemed to press inward. The air carried a weight I couldn't name at first, something sharper than the usual vigilance, something brittle. It began with small things. Vittorio, one of Mateo's oldest captains, started arriving late to meetings. He had always been punctual to the point of obsession, coat brushed, shoes polished, eyes scanning the room as if cataloging threats. Now he slipped in after the others had taken their seats, offering no apology, his gaze sliding away from Matteo's whenever their eyes met. Then there were the whispers that stopped too abruptly when I entered a room. The way certain men no longer acknowledged me with the wary respect they once had. The way Enzo, Matteo's youngest lieutenant, ambitious and quick to smile, began lingering near Vittorio, their heads bent together in low conversation. I noticed because noticing had become the only power I possessed. Matteo noticed too, of course. He noticed everything. But he said nothing to me about it, not directly. Instead, his silences grew heavier. He spent longer hours in his study, door closed. When he emerged, the lines around his eyes were deeper, the set of his jaw harder. At night, when he came to my room, no longer asking permission, simply appearing like a shadow detaching itself from the wall, he held me tighter than before, as if anchoring himself against a storm only he could see coming. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining patterns where none existed, that the paranoia of this world was finally infecting me. But I wasn't. It was a Tuesday evening when the pieces began to fall into place. I was in the library, a room I had claimed as my own sanctuary. High ceilings, leather-bound books no one read, a fireplace that crackled even when the weather didn't demand it. I sat at the long table with a cup of espresso gone cold, pretending to read while actually listening to the voices drifting from the adjacent salon where Matteo was holding court. They spoke in Italian, as they often did when they thought I wasn't near. I had never told anyone how fluent I was, another layer of protection, another secret to hoard. My grandmother had taught me the language alongside the oath, her voice soft and fierce in the dim light of our tiny kitchen. Tonight the conversation was about a shipment. Always shipments, routes, timings, ports, bribes. But something was off. Vittorio's voice carried a note I hadn't heard before: defensiveness. The Albanians are offering better terms, he was saying. We'd be fools not to consider it. A pause. Then Matteo, calm as winter. We do not consider betrayal, Vittorio. We consider loyalty. Or we consider consequences. Another voice, Enzo's, jumping in too quickly. No one's talking betrayal, capo. Just business evolution. I closed the book in my lap. My pulse had begun to race. Business evolution. I had heard that phrase before. 3 nights ago, in the garden. I'd stepped outside for air and seen Enzo on the phone, his back to the house, voice low and urgent. Tell them we're ready. Navarro's distracted. The girl, he's not thinking clearly anymore. This is our window. He hadn't seen me in the shadows. I hadn't told Matteo. Not yet. I'd wanted to be sure. Now I was sure. The betrayal wasn't a possibility. It was in motion. That night, I lay awake beside Matteo long after he'd fallen asleep. His breathing was steady, one arm thrown across my waist, as if even unconscious he needed to keep me close. Moonlight striped the bed through half-closed shutters. I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. I would not wait to be rescued. I would not hide behind his protection while his empire bled out beneath him. If I was truly part of this world now, if I had chosen it, then I would act like it. The next 2 days passed in a haze of preparation. I watched. I listened. I moved through the house like smoke, gathering fragments. A new guard on the east gate, who didn't know the old passwords. Vittorio's sudden interest in the armory logs. Enzo's frequent trips into the city, returning with nothing to show for them. A encrypted message I glimpsed on Vittorio's phone when he left it unattended for 30 crucial seconds. Coordinates. Midnight tomorrow. Come alone. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Tomorrow night, during the weekly dinner with the inner circle, they would make their move. A coordinated strike. Some of Matteo's men turning on the others, the Albanians waiting outside to finish what was started. Matteo would be caught in the center. He would die unless someone warned him. But a warning whispered in private would not be enough. Vittorio was too respected, too entrenched. Doubt would linger. The poison would remain. No. This needed to be public. Decisive. Final. It needed to be me. The night arrived heavy with storm clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance as staff set the long dining table in the great hall. Crystal, silver, White linens pristine against the dark wood. 12 places set. 12 men who would decide whether Matteo lived or died. I wore black. Simple. Severe. Hair pulled back tightly. No jewelry. Nothing to distract. Matteo found me in the corridor before dinner. His hand caught my wrist, pulling me gently into an alcove. "You're quiet tonight," he said, eyes searching my face. "There's much to think about." He brushed a thumb across my cheek. "Whatever happens, you stay close to me. Do you understand?" I met his gaze. I understand. But I had no intention of staying safe. The dinner began normally enough. Wine poured. Plates served. Conversation carefully light. Football scores. Vintage cars. The unseasonable weather. Beneath it all, the tension coiled tighter. Vittorio sat to Matteo's right, as always. Enzo across from him. I stood near the sideboard, ostensibly overseeing staff, but really watching every glance, every shift in posture. The main course had just been cleared when Vittorio raised his glass. "A toast," he said, voice rich with false warmth. "To family, to loyalty." Glasses lifted. I saw Enzo's hand tremble slightly. Matteo's eyes flicked to me for the briefest moment. A question. A warning. I stepped forward. Before anyone could drink, I spoke. My voice carried clearly through the hall, steady despite the thunder in my veins. "A vita e cosa nostra." The room froze. Every man knew those words, knew what they meant when spoken aloud in this company. A binding.
A vow.
A judgment. I looked directly at Vittorio. "Life is ours," I repeated in Italian, slower this time, "but only for those who keep it sacred." Vittorio's glass lowered slowly. His face had gone very still. Enzo shifted in his seat. I didn't stop. "I wonder, Vittorio," I continued, stepping closer to the table, "if you remember teaching those words to your son before he died. Or if you've forgotten them now that another family offers you more money." A murmur rippled through the room. Matteo had gone utterly motionless, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Vittorio found his voice. "You dare." "I dare." I cut in. "Because someone must. Because I have listened to you plan his death for days. Because I have seen the messages. The coordinates. The lies." I turned to Enzo. "And you? You think ambition excuses betrayal? You think the Albanians will honor a dog that bites its master?" Enzo's chair scraped back as he half rose. "You little." But the guards at the doors had already moved, hands on weapons, waiting for Matteo's signal. Vittorio's face twisted. "She's lying. She's nothing. A waitress he dragged in off the street. You take her word over mine?" Matteo finally spoke, voice quiet.
Deadly.
"I would take her word over anyone's." The betrayal hung naked in the air now. No more pretense. Vittorio lunged, not for a weapon but for me, as if silencing me would erase what I'd revealed. He never reached me. The first gunshot came from the hallway. Then chaos erupted. Glass shattered. Men shouted. Chairs overturned. Gunfire echoed through the estate like thunder answering thunder. The first gunshot shattered the chandelier above the table. Crystal rained down like lethal snow, glittering as it fell. Someone screamed. A body hit the floor. Then another shot, closer, deafening, and the great hall exploded into chaos. I didn't move. Not at first. Everything slowed, the way it does in dreams you can't wake from. Men lunged from their chairs, weapons drawn. Loyal guards burst through the side doors, returning fire toward the shadows in the corridor. Vittorio was on his feet, face contorted, pistol in hand, swinging toward Matteo. But Matteo was already moving, faster than I'd ever seen him, a blur of lethal grace. He caught Vittorio's wrist, twisted, and the gun clattered across the table, knocking over wine glasses that bled red across the white linen. Enzo scrambled backward, knocking over his chair, eyes wild as he fumbled for the weapon at his belt. I still hadn't moved. The oath I'd spoken hung in the air like smoke, binding the moment. Every man in the room knew what it meant when a woman, an outsider, dared to utter those words in judgment. Life is ours. And betrayal is death. Vittorio snarled, grappling with Matteo. They crashed into the table's edge, plate shattering. She's poison, Vittorio spat, straining against Matteo's iron grip. She's turned you weak, made you forget who we are. Matteo's voice was ice.
No.
You forgot. He drove his knee into Vittorio's stomach, doubling him over, then slammed his head against the table with a sickening crack. Vittorio slumped, dazed, blood trickling from his temple. Enzo had his gun out now, hands shaking as he leveled it. Not at Matteo, but at me. You should have stayed invisible, he hissed. The shot never came. One of Matteo's guards tackled him from behind. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the pistol skittering across the marble floor toward my feet. I bent and picked it up. The room was still raging. Gunfire in the halls, shouts, the crash of furniture, but around the table a strange pocket of silence formed. The remaining men, the ones still loyal, had formed a loose circle, weapons trained outward, protecting their capo.
And me.
I walked forward, the gun heavy in my hand, until I stood over Vittorio. He looked up at me, breathing hard, hatred burning in his eyes. You think this changes anything? He rasped. You're nothing. A stray he picked up. You don't belong here. I knelt slowly, bringing us eye to eye. My voice was quiet, but it carried. I belong wherever loyalty lives, I said in Italian. And you forfeited yours the moment you sold him for coin. Then, louder, so every man could hear. A vita e cosa nostra. I said it again, deliberate, each word a hammer strike. Life belongs to us. To those who keep faith. To those who protect it with blood, if necessary. Vittorio tried to laugh, but it came out a cough. Pretty words from a waitress. I pressed the barrel of the gun beneath his chin, forcing his head back. These aren't pretty words, I said. They're the ones your father taught mine. The ones my grandmother whispered over my cradle to keep me safe from men like you. The ones you betrayed when you invited wolves to this table. The room had gone deathly still now. Even the gunfire in the distance seemed muffled, as if the estate itself held its breath. Matteo stood behind me, unmoving. I could feel his gaze on my back, intense, unreadable. I looked up at the circle of men. Some I knew by name, others only by face. All of them were watching me now, not Matteo. This man planned to kill your capo tonight, I said. He and Enzo. They sold routes, names, safe houses. They opened the gates for the Albanians. And they would have stood over his body and called it progress. A low growl rippled through the loyal ones. I turned back to Vittorio. Speak, I said. Deny it. He spat blood onto the floor. I deny nothing. He's lost his edge.
Soft.
Because of you. Matteo stepped forward then. Slowly. Deliberately. He didn't look at Vittorio.
He looked only at me.
Give me the gun, Isabella, he said softly. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then handed it to him, grip first. He took it without breaking eye contact. Then he turned to Vittorio. The shot was single.
Clean.
Final. Vittorio's body jerked once, and went still. No one spoke. Matteo handed the gun to the nearest guard, then looked at Enzo, still pinned to the floor, face pale with terror. Take him outside, Matteo said. Let the others see what happens to traitors. 2 guards hauled Enzo up. He didn't struggle. He couldn't even look at me. As they dragged him away, Matteo addressed the room. His voice was steady, but something in it trembled, just beneath the surface. From tonight forward, he said, there is no question of loyalty here. No doubt. No hesitation. He turned to me fully. And there is no question of who stands beside me. He reached out and took my hand, not possessively, not gently, but as an equal. Raised it so every man could see. In silence, he said, she is my equal. In judgment, she is my voice. In this house, her word is mine. A murmur of assent moved through the men. Some nodded. Others placed fists over hearts, an old gesture I'd seen only in photographs of my grandmother's youth. The gunfire outside had stopped. The estate was secure again. but the air still crackled. Matteo dismissed the men with a quiet command. They filed out, stepping carefully around the blood and broken crystal, casting glances back at us, at me, that held something new. Not suspicion, not fear, respect. When we were alone among the wreckage, Matteo finally looked at me. Really looked. His face, always so controlled, had cracked open. His hand tightened around mine until it almost hurt. "You could have died," he said, voice raw. "You stood there with a gun to your head, and you didn't flinch." I swallowed. "I couldn't let you die." He made a sound, half laugh, half groan, and pulled me against him suddenly, fiercely. His arms banded around me like steel, his face buried in my hair. "I was raised to destroy anything that made me weak," he whispered against my skin. "Anything I couldn't bear to lose." He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. His were bright with something fierce and fragile. "You make me weak, Isabella, and I don't want to destroy you." His forehead rested against mine. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, the words torn out of him. "I don't know how to love something without breaking it." The confession hung between us, naked and trembling. I reached up, fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "Then don't break me," I said softly. "Just hold on." He exhaled, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. And then he kissed me. Not like before, not controlled, not measured, not a claim. This was surrender. His mouth on mine was desperate, reverent, shaking with everything he'd never allowed himself to feel. His hands framed my face, as if I were something sacred and breakable and essential all at once. I kissed him back with everything I had: fear, fire, choice. When we broke apart, foreheads still touching, breaths ragged, he whispered one last thing against my lips. "I'm yours," he said, "if you'll have me." The great hall around us was ruined, blood on the floor, crystal in shards, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. But in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something unbreakable. Dawn crept over the estate like a hesitant intruder. The great hall had been cleared in the night, blood scrubbed from marble, broken crystals swept away, bodies removed to wherever such things went. Only faint scars remained, a chip in the table's edge, a scorch mark on the wall where a bullet had bitten deep. The house staff moved in silence, eyes lowered, as if the violence had left a residue they feared to disturb. I stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, wrapped in one of Matteo's shirts, the sleeves rolled to my elbows. The air was cool, scented with jasmine and wet earth from the storm. My hands still trembled faintly, though the adrenaline had long ebbed. I kept seeing Vittorio's eyes in the moment the light left them. I kept hearing the single shot that ended decades of loyalty turned rotten. Footsteps behind me, measured, familiar. Matteo. He didn't speak at first. He simply came to stand beside me, hands braced on the stone balustrade, gazing out at the same horizon. His profile was sharp against the pale light, the shadows under his eyes deeper than I'd ever seen them. He wore a dark sweater, sleeves pushed up, revealing the faint bruises from last night's fight. We stood like that for a long time. Finally, he said, "It's done." I nodded. "I know."
He turned to me then.
Really looked at me, as if memorizing something he feared might vanish. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You saved everything." I shook my head. "We saved it. Together." A faint smile touched his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something heavier lingered there, something he was holding back. He reached into his pocket and drew out a slim envelope. Held it out to me. I took it, frowning. Inside was a passport, new, crisp, the photo unmistakably mine, though I'd never posed for it. The name read Elena Rossi. There was also a bank card, a one-way plane ticket to Vancouver dated 3 days from now, and a folded sheet with an address in a city I didn't recognize. I looked up at him. "Everything you need," he said, voice steady but low. "A clean identity. Enough money to disappear anywhere you want. People who will make sure no one ever finds you. Not my enemies. Not me." The words landed between us like stones. I stared at the passport in my hands. Elena Rossi. A woman with no past, no debts, no blood on her hands. A woman who could walk into an ordinary life and never look back. Freedom. The one thing I'd spent years chasing. First from a life I didn't choose, then from the shadows that followed me, and finally from this house that had become both prison and home. He watched me, face unreadable. "I won't stop you," he said. "I won't follow. You'll be safe. Truly safe." For the first time. His voice cracked on the last words, just barely. I closed the envelope slowly. "And if I stay?" I asked. He exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath since the question formed. "Then you stay as my equal," he said. "Not my responsibility. Not my possession. My partner. In everything. The risks, the decisions, the consequences. All of it." He stepped closer, hands rising to frame my face, gentle, reverent. "But I won't let you choose me out of gratitude," he said. "Or fear. Or momentum. You deserve more than that. You deserve a life unshadowed." I searched his eyes. Saw the war there. The man who had spent a lifetime taking, now offering the one thing he'd never given anyone, a choice that cost him everything if I took it. I thought of the girl who had once believed invisibility was safety, who had pressed her uniform neatly each morning, kept her head down, whispered oaths only in moments of desperation. That girl had vanished somewhere between the first gunshot and the last. I was someone else now. I slipped the passport back into the envelope and held it out to him. He didn't take it. I let it fall to the terrace stones between us. "I won't survive by running any more," I said. His eyes widened just a fraction. "I choose this," I continued. "I choose you. Not because you saved me. Not because I owe you. Because when I stood in that room last night and spoke those words, I meant them. Life is ours. And I want mine with you." He made a sound, low, broken, and pulled me into him. His arms wrapped around me, like he was afraid I'd change my mind and dissolve. I felt his heart hammering against my cheek. "Isabella," he whispered into my hair, my name a prayer and a plea. "You'll never regret this?" "I already have regrets," I said against his chest. "None of them are you." He drew back, eyes searching mine one last time for hesitation. Finding none. He kissed me, slow, deliberate, like a vow renewed in daylight. When we parted, he rested his forehead against mine. "Then we leave today," he said. "For Sicily. The estate there, my mother's old home. It's quiet, safe. A place we can rebuild without ghosts watching every corner." I nodded. Today. By noon, the house was emptying. Staff given generous severance and new positions far away. Loyal men reassigned to hold the remaining territories. Papers burned, accounts shifted, trails erased. We traveled light. 2 bags. No entourage. The private jet lifted off as the sun dipped toward evening, carrying us south across the sea. I watched the coastline recede through the window, the city that had swallowed me whole shrinking to a glittering line, then nothing. Matteo sat beside me, hand entwined with mine. He hadn't let go since we boarded. Below us, news alerts flickered on muted screens in the cabin, brief mentions of a vanished waitress from an exclusive restaurant, last seen months ago. A cold case reopened, then quietly closed for lack of evidence. My old name on missing persons lists. My apartment cleared out, rent paid through the end of the lease by an anonymous donor. Isabella Reyes had disappeared without a trace.
Good.
In Sicily, the air was warmer. The estate perched on a cliff above the turquoise sea, white stone walls, terracotta tiles, bougainvilleas spilling over arches in violent purple. Lemon trees lined the drive. The house smelled of salt and old wood and something indefinably like beginning. We arrived at twilight. Matteo led me through empty rooms that would soon hold whatever life we decided to build. Up a winding staircase to a balcony facing the water. The sky bled orange and rose. He stood behind me, arms around my waist, chin resting on my shoulder. "No one knows we're here," he said quietly. "Not yet. We have time." I leaned back into him. Time for what? To figure out who we are when the world isn't trying to kill us. I smiled at that. I think I already know who I am. He turned me in his arms. And who is that? I reached up, fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the mouth that had once only commanded and now only asked. I'm the woman who wasn't taken, I said. I kissed him softly. I was chosen. Another kiss, deeper, lingering. And I chose you back. Far below, the sea whispered against the rocks, endless and unafraid. Above us, the first stars began to burn. And in the quiet between heartbeats, I heard it, the oath I'd once muttered in fear, now spoken in certainty. A vita e cosa nostra. Life is ours. Finally, truly ours. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below for more stories from the Diaries of Love.